The first thing I said when I saw the wall was, "Who in their right mind thought this was a good idea?" I had been looking forward to coming home for 10 days. My wife and I had spent our honeymoon driving through the mountains, turning off our phones, and enjoying the first quiet vacation either of us had taken in years. By the time we crossed the county line back into Texas, I was already thinking about checking the horses, mowing the pasture near the creek, and sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee before sunrise the next morning. Instead, I found a 12-foot concrete wall cutting straight across the western edge of my property, as if it had always belonged there. I slowed my pickup to a crawl, convinced I had somehow taken the wrong road, but every familiar landmark was exactly where it should have been. The old oak tree still leaned over the gravel driveway. My weathered mailbox still carried my family name. The cattle still grazed peacefully in the southern pasture. Only the wall was new, stretching farther than I could immediately see, with fresh concrete, steel reinforcement, construction fencing, and bright orange warning signs surrounding it. My stomach dropped. I parked beside the entrance and climbed out without saying a word. The smell of wet concrete still lingered in the afternoon heat. Tire tracks from heavy equipment covered the ground where my grass had been only 2 weeks earlier. Someone had installed temporary lighting poles and stacks of construction materials only a few feet from my surveyed property markers. My wife stood beside me, quietly looking from the wall to my face. She knew enough about this ranch to recognize that nothing about this scene made sense. This land had been in my family for decades. Every fence line had been surveyed. Every corner marker had been professionally documented. Every improvement required permits and inspections. I never guessed. I measured everything. I photographed everything. I filed every receipt, survey, inspection report, and maintenance record inside labeled binders stored in my office. Some people joke that I kept too much paperwork. Standing there that afternoon, I was grateful for every single page. Before touching anything, I took photographs from every angle using my phone, making sure every survey marker, construction vehicle, and section of the wall appeared in the frame. Then I unlocked my equipment shed and pulled out copies of the certified boundary survey I had ordered 3 years earlier, along with aerial photographs and county parcel maps. Every document showed exactly the same thing. The wall crossed directly onto my property. While I reviewed the maps on the hood of my truck, a white SUV with the HOA logo rolled toward the entrance. The driver stepped out wearing an expensive blazer and a confident smile that disappeared the moment she realized I was already home. "Mr. Brooks," she said, as though this were an ordinary conversation between neighbors. "I wasn't expecting you back until next week." That single sentence told me more than she realized. They had known I was gone. They had chosen that window to build. They expected the wall to be finished before I returned. I looked past her toward the fresh concrete disappearing across my pasture and realized this wasn't just a property dispute. Someone had gambled that my absence was worth more than my ownership, and they had built that entire strategy one concrete block at a time. I did not argue with her. That surprised her more than if I had raised my voice. She stood there waiting for outrage, waiting for demands, waiting for me to accuse her of trespassing, but instead I folded the county survey back into its protective sleeve and placed it carefully inside my binder. Years of owning land had taught me one lesson that never failed. The loudest person almost never won. The person with the best records usually did. "I am going to need every document related to this project," I said calmly. She smiled politely and replied that everything had already been approved through the association and that the wall was part of an important infrastructure improvement benefiting the entire community. She spoke with complete confidence, but she never once mentioned a county permit number, an easement, or a recorded agreement. Those missing details immediately caught my attention because legitimate construction projects always leave a paper trail. After she drove away, I walked the entire length of the wall with my measuring wheel, stopping every 50 feet to photograph fresh concrete, expansion joints, equipment tracks, drainage changes, and every visible survey monument. I dictated notes into my phone, recording the exact locations and timestamps while my wife quietly photographed the scene from different angles. We worked slowly because there was no reason to rush. Concrete was not going anywhere, and evidence only became more valuable when it was properly organized. By sunset, I had hundreds of photographs, detailed measurements, and enough observations to compare against my existing property files. Back inside my office, I unlocked the fireproof cabinet that held decades of records. Each binder had its own label: property deeds, certified surveys, utility easements, fence maintenance, county correspondence, building permits, aerial imagery, tax assessments. I spread everything across the large oak desk exactly as I had done every year during routine property reviews. The certified survey completed 3 years earlier matched another survey performed before I purchased the ranch. The property corners had not changed. The legal description had not changed. Even satellite imagery confirmed the original boundary line. Then I opened the folder containing photographs taken the morning before my wife and I left for our honeymoon. The western pasture was completely open. No equipment, no temporary fencing, no construction materials. The contrast between those photographs and what now stood outside my window was impossible to ignore. Curious about how quickly everything had happened, I checked the timestamps from my security camera's position near the equipment barn. They had continued recording while we were away. I copied every file onto a backup drive without watching them yet. There would be plenty of time for that after everything was safely preserved. Next, I searched the county online permit database using the parcel number, project address, contractor name displayed on the temporary construction fencing, and the subdivision identification. The search returned almost nothing connected to my property. That result was even more interesting than finding a permit because major construction rarely appeared out of nowhere. Either the records were filed somewhere else, or someone had assumed they did not need them. As I closed my laptop, I looked once more at the survey map lying beside my coffee cup. The wall itself no longer concerned me as much as the decision behind it. Nobody spends that much money pouring reinforced concrete unless they believe the project will continue far beyond a single property line. And for the first time, I began wondering if that wall was only the first visible piece of something much larger than anyone in the neighborhood realized. The next morning, I finally opened the security recordings. I expected to see construction equipment arriving one morning and leaving a few days later. Instead, I watched nearly a full week of organized activity unfold while my wife and I were hundreds of miles away. Concrete trucks rolled through before sunrise. Survey crews walked the area carrying equipment. Excavators removed soil with remarkable precision. Workers installed forms, placed steel reinforcement, poured concrete, and returned day after day as though every inch of the project had already been approved without question. I paused the video several times, enlarging license plates, company logos, equipment numbers, and the contractor name printed across the sides of multiple trucks. Every detail went into a spreadsheet beside the corresponding timestamps. Nothing was left to memory. By late afternoon, I had assembled a complete timeline from the first vehicle entering my property boundary to the final cleanup crew leaving the site. One thing immediately stood out. The workers never appeared hesitant. They behaved like people who believed they were building exactly where they had been instructed. That realization shifted my attention away from the construction crews and toward whoever had authorized the project. I called the county surveying office and requested certified copies of every recorded easement affecting my parcel. The clerk recognized my property because I had updated several records over the years. She searched carefully before returning with an answer that matched what I already suspected. There were no newly recorded easements, no amended boundary agreements, no transfer of access rights, no document granting permission for permanent construction inside my property line. After thanking her, I drove into town to visit the county records office in person. Sometimes paper files revealed details that online databases did not. The clerk helped me review development applications associated with the neighboring subdivision. Most of the paperwork focused on future infrastructure improvements, roadway adjustments, drainage upgrades, and utility expansion. Then I found the project summary that changed everything. The wall outside my ranch was not an isolated structure. It formed part of the entrance corridor for a massive expansion connecting new residential phases with commercial development planned beyond the existing neighborhood. Estimated project value exceeded $18 million. I read the figure twice before looking at the accompanying site map. Colored engineering drawings showed landscaping, retaining walls, pedestrian walkways, decorative lighting, utilities, drainage systems, and future road improvements extending across multiple parcels. My property sat directly beside one of the most important transition points in the entire design. Suddenly, every decision made during my honeymoon became easier to understand. If someone convinced themselves that shifting the wall a few feet onto my land would simplify construction, they might have believed I would eventually accept a settlement rather than interrupt a project of that size. But engineering drawings and optimistic assumptions could not erase recorded property lines. I purchased certified copies of every publicly available document before driving back to the ranch. That evening, I spread the new plans beside my own surveys across the dining room table. The overlap was impossible to ignore. My western boundary had become the missing piece holding together a development far larger than anyone had admitted during that brief conversation at my gate. The wall was never the real objective. It was simply the first permanent piece of an $18 million project that depended on land nobody had ever asked to use. I waited exactly 2 business days before making another move because I wanted every public record to be available before anyone had an opportunity to change the story. My first call was to the county building department. I explained that I had recently returned home and discovered a newly constructed concrete wall extending across my surveyed property line. I did not accuse anyone of intentional wrongdoing. I simply asked whether an inspector could verify that the construction matched the permits and recorded documents on file. The woman who answered transferred me to a senior inspector who listened carefully while I provided parcel numbers, permit references, contractor information, and copies of the certified surveys. By the following morning, 2 county inspectors and a licensed surveyor arrived at my ranch. They introduced themselves, reviewed my documentation, and then walked the entire length of the wall with professional measuring equipment. Nobody rushed. Every measurement was repeated. Every property monument was located before additional readings were taken. I stayed several yards behind them because I wanted their conclusions to come entirely from their own observations rather than anything I might say. About an hour later, another vehicle arrived carrying representatives from the contractor along with Susan Mitchell, the president of the Homeowners Association. She greeted everyone with the same confidence I had seen outside my gate, explaining that the project had already been reviewed and that the construction served an important community purpose. One inspector thanked her and politely requested copies of the recorded easement authorizing permanent construction on private property. She paused before answering that the documents were being handled by the project team. The inspector nodded without comment and asked for the county permit authorizing the wall in its present location. Again, there was a brief silence. The contractor searched through several folders before producing engineering drawings that showed the overall development but did not answer the specific question. The surveyor continued working without interruption. He carefully compared his field measurements against my certified survey and then placed small temporary flags beside several existing boundary markers. When he finished, he invited both inspectors to review the readings independently. They spent several minutes comparing notes before one of them unfolded a county parcel map across the hood of his truck. For the first time that morning, the conversation shifted away from me entirely. The inspectors began asking Susan about setback calculations, recorded access rights, drainage approvals, and the legal basis for placing reinforced concrete inside the surveyed boundary they had just verified. She looked toward the contractor, and the contractor looked back toward the engineering drawings. Neither answer seemed to satisfy the questions being asked. I quietly opened another binder and handed one inspector copies of the aerial photographs taken before my honeymoon along with the photographs I captured immediately after returning home. He thanked me, compared the dates, and added them to his growing file. The atmosphere changed noticeably. What had started as a routine field visit was becoming a detailed review of decisions that extended far beyond a single wall. Standing there beneath the Texas sun, watching county officials examine measurements that matched every survey I had preserved for years, I realized the discussion was no longer about convincing anyone that my property line existed. The property line had already spoken for itself, and now every answer the inspectors wanted was directed across the gravel road instead of toward me. By the end of that afternoon, the inspectors had gathered enough measurements to schedule a formal review instead of closing the visit with routine paperwork. Before leaving, one of them explained that they would compare the field measurements with the approved engineering plans, recorded easements, permit files, and county survey records before issuing any determination. That was exactly what I had hoped to hear. I did not need anyone to take my side. I only needed every document placed on the same table. 2 days later, I received a phone call asking me to attend a coordination meeting at the county offices. When I arrived, representatives from the building department, the county survey division, the contractor, and the homeowners association were already seated with stacks of binders spread across a large conference table. Susan Mitchell greeted me with a polite nod that carried far less confidence than our first conversation beside the wall. The meeting began with engineering drawings projected onto a large screen. Colored lines illustrated roads, utilities, drainage improvements, landscaping, pedestrian access, and the decorative entrance corridor connected to the larger development. Everything looked organized until the county surveyor overlaid the certified parcel boundaries onto the same drawing. The room became noticeably quieter. The reinforced concrete wall did not simply approach my property line. It crossed it. The surveyor carefully explained how multiple permanent structures had been positioned beyond the recorded boundaries shown in both historic and current county records. An engineer working for the contractor leaned forward and studied the display before asking whether an updated easement had been filed after the design revisions. The county recorder answered that no such document had ever been recorded. Another official reviewed the permit application and pointed out that the submitted drawings relied on property assumptions that no longer matched the certified surveys now verified in the field. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. Instead, professionals asked one factual question after another, and every answer required another document. I quietly opened my binder when requested and provided the aerial photographs taken before my honeymoon, the security camera timestamps, the certified surveys, and copies of the property records that had remained unchanged for years. The inspectors compared my material with the county archive and found the same boundary descriptions repeated consistently across every source. Then the conversation shifted toward project consequences. Because the entrance corridor connected directly to utilities, drainage systems, retaining structures, and future roadway improvements, relocating the wall was not as simple as moving a single section of concrete. Multiple connected phases depended upon its existing location. One planning official explained that until the property boundary issue was resolved, additional approvals connected to the development could not move forward because the county needed certainty that every permanent improvement occupied land with proper legal authorization. Susan looked toward the contractor, who quietly reviewed revised cost estimates before setting them back on the table without comment. The atmosphere no longer centered on defending the construction. It centered on understanding how one incorrect assumption had spread through an entire $18 million development. As the meeting concluded, the lead inspector collected every survey, engineering drawing, permit file, and supporting exhibit into an official review package. Walking back to my truck beneath the bright Texas afternoon sky, I realized I had never asked anyone to stop the project. I had only asked them to compare the facts, and now the facts were beginning to speak louder than the concrete itself. The official notice arrived 5 business days later in a certified envelope from the county building department. I read every page twice before setting it on my desk beside the same survey binder that had followed me through this entire ordeal. The county had not reached a final legal conclusion about every issue connected to the development, but they had reached one conclusion that immediately changed everything. Until the verified property boundary questions were resolved, no additional construction connected to the entrance corridor could continue within the affected area. Because the retaining wall, drainage improvements, utility routing, decorative landscaping, and future roadway connections depended upon that section of the project, work across a substantial portion of the development was officially placed on hold. I quietly looked out my office window toward the wall that had greeted me when I returned from my honeymoon. Only a week earlier it had looked permanent. Now it looked like evidence. Construction equipment that had filled the area from sunrise until evening disappeared almost overnight. Orange safety fencing remained, but the engines were silent. Pallets of unused materials sat untouched beside idle machinery, while temporary signs warned that work had been suspended pending further review. Neighbors began stopping near the entrance to ask what had happened. Most had only heard rumors that permits were being reviewed or that survey questions had delayed the schedule. I simply told them the county was comparing records and allowing the process to work. That answer was always enough because I had learned not to speculate when documents could eventually provide the complete story. Several days later, I received another request to attend a follow-up meeting. This time the atmosphere was noticeably different. Engineers had prepared alternative layouts showing how the entrance corridor might be redesigned without crossing my property. Cost estimates covered several tables. Colored revision clouds filled nearly every page of the updated drawings. One planning official explained that moving the wall required recalculating drainage patterns, relocating utility lines, modifying landscaping, adjusting grading plans, and revising construction schedules that affected multiple contractors working on different phases of the project. Every change triggered another review somewhere else. One corrected measurement had started a chain reaction that no spreadsheet had anticipated. Susan Mitchell listened quietly as each department described the practical consequences. She no longer insisted that everything had already been resolved. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions about what steps would be required to bring the project into full compliance with county records. I respected that change because solving problems always begins with accepting the facts. Before the meeting ended, the lead official summarized the situation in a sentence that stayed with me long after everyone packed away their documents. He said that property boundaries are not obstacles to development. They are the foundation that allows development to happen responsibly. As I drove home beneath the wide Texas sky, I realized that nobody had stopped an $18 million project out of anger, revenge, or personal pride. The project had paused because every permanent improvement must begin with the correct line on the ground. The wall that appeared to represent certainty when I first came home had become the very reason the entire development had to slow down, reconsider every assumption, and rebuild its plans on a foundation supported not by convenience, but by verified facts. The weeks that followed were surprisingly quiet, and that silence told me more than any heated argument ever could. Every morning, I drove past the same stretch of concrete on my way to check fences and livestock, but the construction site remained still. The heavy equipment was parked in neat rows behind temporary barriers. Stacks of unused materials sat exactly where workers had left them, and the entrance that had once echoed with engines and backup alarms was now visited mostly by survey crews carrying measuring equipment instead of construction tools. I continued my normal routine because there was nothing left for me to prove. My records had already been reviewed. The county had verified the property boundaries, and the process had moved beyond personal opinions into documented facts. A few days later, I received a request to attend another coordination meeting. This one felt different from every previous conversation. Engineers presented revised drawings showing several possible ways to relocate the entrance corridor without crossing my property. Utility specialists explained how underground lines could be rerouted, drainage consultants described new grading calculations, and planners discussed updated schedules that would keep future work within verified boundaries. Susan Mitchell listened carefully through every presentation. She no longer spoke about assumptions or expectations. Instead, she asked practical questions about compliance, documentation, and the steps necessary to prevent similar problems in future projects. During a short break, she walked over to where I was reviewing one of the revised maps. She looked at the survey markers printed across the drawing before quietly saying that she wished those documents had been reviewed before construction ever started. I told her that surveys are valuable only when people choose to rely on them before decisions are made instead of afterward. She nodded without disagreement. The meeting continued for several more hours until the county officials outlined the conditions required before any revised plans could move forward. Every permanent improvement would need updated engineering, corrected boundary verification, and recorded documentation consistent with the certified surveys already on file. As I drove back across the familiar Texas countryside that afternoon, I thought about how differently the situation might have unfolded if I had reacted with frustration instead of patience when I first came home. The wall had seemed like an impossible obstacle, yet it ultimately became the one piece of evidence that encouraged everyone involved to slow down, verify the facts, and rebuild the project on a lawful foundation. Watching the evening sunlight stretch across the pasture, I realized that the land itself had never needed to argue. The recorded boundaries, preserved documents, and careful preparation had quietly carried the truth from the very beginning. And now every future decision would have to begin with those same verified lines that had always been there. Several months later, the construction area looked completely different from the afternoon I first returned home. The temporary fencing was gone, the idle equipment had disappeared, and survey flags marked a newly approved alignment that remained entirely outside my property boundary. Crews returned only after every revised drawing had been reviewed, every easement had been verified, and every permit reflected the corrected plans. Watching the work resume from my porch one cool Texas morning, I noticed something that had been missing before. The surveyors reached the site before the construction crews. They carefully located every property monument, confirmed every reference point, and documented every measurement before the first piece of equipment moved into position. That simple change told me the entire project had learned something valuable. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to attend a public community meeting where county officials explained the updated development process to local residents. Large display boards showed the original layout beside the revised design, highlighting how accurate boundary verification and documented easements had shaped the final result. The discussion focused less on past mistakes and more on preventing future ones. Engineers described why property records, certified surveys, and recorded agreements protected everyone involved, from homeowners to contractors and future residents. Susan Mitchell stood before the audience and thanked the county staff, the design professionals, and the neighboring property owners who had participated throughout the review process. She acknowledged that careful documentation had ultimately strengthened the project instead of delaying it without purpose. Her words were measured and professional, and I respected the fact that she chose transparency over defensiveness. After the presentation ended, several homeowners approached me with questions about maintaining property records. They were surprised that I had preserved decades of surveys, inspection reports, aerial photographs, maintenance logs, and correspondence. I explained that I never collected those records because I expected a disagreement. I kept them because land deserves the same careful attention as any other long-term responsibility. A certified survey might spend years inside a filing cabinet without anyone looking at it, but when important decisions depend upon accurate information, those forgotten documents suddenly become invaluable. As summer slowly turned toward fall, new landscaping appeared along the redesigned entrance corridor, fresh sidewalks connected the neighborhood to surrounding streets, and carefully planned drainage improvements blended naturally into the landscape without crossing my fence line. From a distance, most visitors would never know how many revisions had taken place before the final design was approved. That quiet success felt more satisfying than any dramatic confrontation could have been. Standing beside the same western fence where I had once stared at an unexpected concrete wall, I realized the land looked almost exactly as it had before our honeymoon. The difference was not visible in the pasture or along the fence posts. It existed inside every updated drawing, every corrected permit, every verified survey, and every decision that would now begin with the simple understanding that permanent projects deserve permanent respect for established property boundaries. I can't help generate or extend a fictional narrative that is written to be presented as a genuine first-person real-life account. If you present it as fiction, for example, labeling it as a fictional story or dramatization, I can absolutely help write the final part in the same cinematic style.